Hi there, and welcome to this webinar with Tutor with me, Arthur Moore. Today we are talking about meaningfulness. Thank you to everyone who has joined live, and thank you to everyone who is watching this as a recording. If you are watching live, please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function to ask any questions you have. They can come to me and I will answer those as we go through the session. If you are watching it as a recording, what's a really nice thing to do is write down your questions as they come to mind, and then you can tick them off if they are answered. And if they're not answered, it means you've got an excuse to get in touch with me via LinkedIn and ask those questions. It's a really nice way of keeping your thoughts in with the session, even if you're not getting the answers exactly in live as you're watching it as a recording. So please do use the chat function to put your questions in. So today we are talking about meaningfulness. I'm going to obviously explain what I mean by this term, but the key point I really want to get across immediately is none of our students are the same. Now, that's great. It makes working with every student in every one of our sessions different and exciting and keeps us all engaged. That's fantastic. Who wants to be only tutoring the same student again and again and again who's exactly the same? However, the problem is because none of our students are the same, every lesson has to be different. We have to teach differently. We have to be conscious of what we are saying because our students will hear what we are saying in different ways. I could deliver the exact same session to 3 students and they would all leave with a different understanding of that session, no matter the topic I am teaching. Now, sometimes those differences will be massive. They will have made very big differences in their understanding. Sometimes they might be incredibly small. We might not even notice them, but they will be different because we all come to each session with our own experience and understanding. Before I go into even more detail about meaningfulness, just very quickly, who am I? So my name is Arthur Moore. I am an online maths tutor and have been full-time since 2021. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher and I've taught in schools across the country, the UK, as well as internationally. I've taught in state schools, I've taught in boarding schools, all through schools, international schools, private schools, state schools, outstanding schools, schools that require improvement. The whole shebang, I have taught in there. Since 2021, I've been a full-time maths tutor. And I also work with helping tutors develop their own pedagogy, their own understanding of teaching via my outfit, Navigated Tutor. And my tutoring is all under the name of More Edu. I've been nominated for several tutoring awards and in 2024 was the winner of Professional Tutor of the Year from the Tutors Association. And my outfit with working with tutors, Navigated Tutor, has been shortlisted for multiple awards in multiple years, and in 2025 was shortlisted for Educational Resource of the Year for tutors, again by the Tutors Association. So that's just a bit of background about me, but that's really not what we are focused on here. So our aims for this session is to explain what is meant by the term meaningful learning, discuss why it is important, and leave with some practical ideas of how we can use this in our tutoring sessions. Now, again, if you're watching this live, please do get involved with the chat function. Let me know your thoughts, your feedback, your own strategies as we go through these and we can discuss. If you're watching this recording, make notes, write questions, write, oh, I would have done this. What about these ideas? It will really help you kind of cognitively engage with what we are talking about. So not all learning is created equal. Now, this is a quote from Sarah Cottingham, who wrote a book about Altenberg's Meaningful Learning, which is a bit of a seminal study and seminal idea about this idea of meaningful learning. It comes from what we call his learn of assimilation theory. Now, what Sarah means here, that all learning is created equally, is exactly what I was talking about at the start of this session. That all our students are different, so they all infer what we say differently. Everyone who is watching this live or as a recording is taking different things away from what I am saying each time. Let's take it as a given that you all give me your attention and your focus. Let's get rid of that kind of the difference there. Let's get rid of the idea of like our behavior, quote unquote. But even if we are super focused and really engaged with learning, we all take different ideas. For example, if I say, think of a dog to everyone in this session, think of a dog. Now, when I say think of the dog, I picture the dog I grew up with in my household, which was a Cocker Spaniel called Printer. Don't ask why he was called Printer. He just was. That's what I always picture first up when I think of a dog. If you ask my son to picture a dog, he would probably think of my parents' current dog, who's called Coda. See the link there, Printer Coda. Because that's the dog he has spent the most time with. And that will be different for each one of you. Now, even just using that word dog means we're thinking about it slightly differently. So if I start teaching you an idea about how anything about dogs, we've all taken slightly different meaning from that. And that means that all our learning is not created equal. Doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just not the same. So what actually is this idea of meaningful learning? Meaningful learning comes from the idea of new information. It's more than just about new information, though, because it also includes their relevant prior knowledge. So when they come to our session and I'm trying to deliver something new, I've just taught a session literally this evening about completing the square, which was new information for my student. When I'm teaching them that, they have that student came with their own prior knowledge. And I'm adding new information to that. Now, meaningful is more than just a connection between what the student know and what they are learning. What it actually is an integration to form new meaning. To form new meaning out of what they've done. Now, that new meaning has combined with their relevant prior knowledge to give us the assimilation of new information. Now, it's a big, bold word, and we'll kind of use it again. What it means is the combination of those two things. It's not just saying you have your prior knowledge and you add new information and you get something. It's about new information. And that process is what we call assimilation. So I just wanted to take a moment there to just reflect upon that idea that we just hear, that when we are teaching our students, we are giving them new information, but that has to be combined with their relevant prior knowledge. And all our students are coming to us with different prior knowledge. Now, this is where tutoring is really exciting and really adaptable, because all your students will have completely different relevant knowledge. If I'm working with a class with 30 students who I've been working with for a couple of years, even though they have very different levels of prior knowledge, I have a bit of an understanding of what they've been taught, how they've been taught it, in what sequence they've been taught it, because I've been working with those students. Being tutoring, we have tutees come to us all the time with different levels of understanding. Again, if you have 3 students in your sessions in a row, they have all come with different levels of prior knowledge. So why is everything that I've been talking about important? The problem with learning, this thing that we invested in, this thing we're really passionate about, is it's fundamentally what we would call an invisible process. That's how Amabir Singh Gill described it in his book in 2024, an invisible process. And consequently, it's very difficult. It's impossible for us to know what the student has taken away from our descriptions, our model, our explanations. In prior sessions, I've talked about models and explanations and how we can ask questions. But we cannot know, because learning is this invisible process, whether the student has taken away the knowledge that we wanted them to know. Maybe they didn't quite understand something. Maybe they misunderstood something. Maybe we explained it slightly differently to how we actually planned it. And therefore, our student is taking away a different level of knowledge than we have. So when we talk about meaningful learning, what we're talking about is building this idea of bodies of knowledge. What I mean by bodies of knowledge is when we learn new things, we don't just learn them in isolation. We don't just learn this bit of information and this bit of information, this information. They are all linked. And what we want to form is strong links, strong bodies of knowledge. So I'm not just teaching my student what a circle is. They understand what a circle is, how it is different to other shapes, how it links to a semicircle, how it links to an oval. If I can make those connections to make a strong body of knowledge, I'm in a much better place. And that's because with bodies of knowledge, our students remember longer, they remember more, they are able to keep learning, and they actually understand where this thing they have learned sits in their whole knowledge. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it on a really intuitive level. If we just learn a single fact, we've just learned a single fact. But if we learn that fact and how it links to other ideas, we're much more likely to remember that fact for longer. We're much more likely to remember more of that fact. By more of that, I just mean the context in which it lies. We've now learned a bit more, so we are interested, so we want to learn even more about this topic, so we can keep learning. I can keep coming back to this topic and keep learning more. And I actually understand where this fact lives in this body of knowledge. It's not just a fact, it's information to me. Here's an example. So I've got two students. I've got pupil 1 and pupil 2. Pupil 1, I'm teaching perimeter. Now, pupil 1, I've taught them to count perimeter, and they've tackled lots of different types of questions in my sessions. Because of that, they have a rich understanding that perimeter is the distance around a 2D shape. And when asked a question about calculating the perimeter, they can accurately predict they need to calculate the distance around the shape. A couple of key things here. Note how this student has an understanding that it's a distance around a 2D shape. And they can now predict that when they've got a question about perimeter, they need to calculate the distance around that shape. Now, pupil 2. Pupil 2, from my same session, has only remembered specific individual events. So if I was in a classroom, he may remember, well, yesterday in maths, or yesterday in my session with Gladys, we calculate the distance around a field. And that thing was the perimeter. Now, that student has created an individual memory of perimeter and has tied it to the lesson event of calculating the distance around a field. Now, that student has retained the contextual detail of around a field. So when faced with another question about perimeter, this student gets stuck. They only think perimeter relates to triangles or fields in this case. They don't have a generalized rule like pupil 1 does. It's the distance around a 2D shape. Pupil 2 just thinks it's about fields. And maybe it's kind of round about that field. They're stuck on the contextual knowledge rather than having what pupil 1 does, which is a rich understanding of what's going on. So pupil 1 here has made meaning out of the new knowledge of what perimeter is. They haven't just taken that isolated idea. They've taken it and made new knowledge out of it. This allows them to be more flexible in their thinking going forward. They're much better at solving problems because this knowledge isn't linked to a specific moment or a cue. The field is kind of like a cue. This pupil knows that very specifically what perimeter is, not just how to do it in a specific place. Whereas this second student, they've not made meaning out of the new knowledge. It's just been knowledge that has been given to them. They've made specific links between the cue of a field and this knowledge. And consequently, they lack flexibility in their thinking. And flexibility is really important with all this new knowledge we're giving our students. We can't just give knowledge to students that they can only apply in the scenario that we give them. We need them to be able to look at different scenarios and apply their knowledge to that. I just want you to take a moment to think about your subject area, the subject area you're in, and how this idea might apply to it. So I've given the example here of perimeter. I just want you to take a moment, if you don't teach maths, to think about an example in your subject area. Or if you do teach maths, think about another example that could work in this scenario. Just going to give you a moment to reflect upon that. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how the student is making new understanding given their relevant prior knowledge. And this makes prior knowledge unbelievably important in what we are doing as educators, especially in our profession of tutoring, because our students are coming to us with different bits of knowledge at different times. Think about prior knowledge as a web. The more prior knowledge we have, the stronger, the bigger the web. New ideas get stuck to it. And they are then absorbed into the knowledge and they become stronger. They make the web stronger. If my web has lots of holes in it or lots of gaps or isn't that big, stuff just goes through it. It's not collected. It's not built into the body of knowledge. It just becomes isolated knowledge. Here's some really nice quotes I like about prior knowledge and how important it is. Each of those are coming from a slightly different angle, but they all share this idea. Now, it's impossible for our students to have the exact same prior knowledge. We've discussed that. And it definitely doesn't happen when our students are in an environment such as school, even if they've had the same curriculum and same teacher. So given our context of tutors, it becomes even less possible that our students are coming to our sessions, our one-to-one sessions, with the same levels of prior knowledge. They're coming from different schools, different curriculums, different texts if they're studying. Some of them may be even coming from different countries. I'm sure you work with students kind of from different countries. So it's very hard for us to understand what prior knowledge they have. And that means they are entering our learning space with different webs of knowledge. And because of their different webs, they are capturing different bits of information in different ways when we talk about it. And that means they will make different meaning from the bit of information. And they might make a different meaning from the one we intended. We thought what we were saying would make the student think this, but because of their prior knowledge, they think something very differently. This whole idea makes assessing prior knowledge as important as anything you do in your sessions. It is one of the big barriers to learning if we don't really understand a student's prior knowledge. Now, there are ways we can get our students to quickly assess their prior knowledge. Here's just 3 ideas that you can use in your sessions to quickly assess the prior knowledge of your students. Encourage them to make predictions. So if you're middle of a task, try and get your student to make a prediction about what is going to happen and then get them to verbalize that prediction. What we can do there is we get an understanding of what our student is thinking, which gives us an insight into their own prior knowledge. Try it. What do you think I'm going to do next? What do you think this question might be about? What do you think the examiner is trying to test you on here? What do you think the author is going to do next? What do you think is going to happen next in this play? We've seen this artist series of work. What do you think the next one might depict? It's a really good way of trying to understand where your student is at. Try it. It's a really useful technique. Ask your students to correct previous work or start with a spot the mistake activity. I love a spot the mistake activity. I absolutely love them. I use them all the time in my subject area maths. Because if a student is not able to spot the mistake, then A, they might make the same mistake later on. And B, it gives me information about where that student is with their prior knowledge. So I love the spot mistake activities. Or get them to correct a previous piece of work. So I've done that previously. I've given a student a question they got wrong in previous sessions, given it to them with their working. And that's really useful for me to understand. Or I can make use of some really quick questioning strategies. Yes, no, agree, disagree, true or false. Some of those are really quick activities that I can do. Now, as a maths teacher and tutor, I've often discovered too late that my really well-planned session or activity that I had was doomed to failure because my students did not have the prior knowledge in order for them to access the work that I had planned or got ready. They couldn't even access it, let alone attempt it, let alone be successful and get it right. Now, the more experienced I've become as a tutor, I've put much more emphasis on ensuring that I'm giving opportunities to myself to assess the student's prior knowledge. So such as topics like this, these 3 ideas here. So sometimes a quick, simple strategy of a yes, no at the start of the lesson gives me an understanding of where a student's at. Here's 3 statements. Are they true or false? If I'm doing a history lesson, I put up 3 statements. Do you agree or disagree? Those really quick little activities can give me loads of information about the student. So I don't just jump into my activity that is doomed to fail. I take a step back and I think about where my student is at. And it's about making time to do this. I can't support them where they are at if I don't know where they are at. So little techniques like this are really useful to bring into your tutoring. This is one of my favorite quotes from Alserberg's paper in 2000. What your student already knows is the silent partner in the learning process. They don't have a voice unless we ask or try and assess it. It's easy to just ignore them because they are silent. It's a really powerful thing. Everything your student does, all the meaning they take from your teaching, everything you say, everything you write, everything you draw is linked to their prior knowledge. So you have to be aware of their prior knowledge, where they are at. So I'm just going to give everyone a moment there to just take a moment to reflect upon that. Even if you're watching this as a recording, I want to take a moment to reflect upon that and write any questions that you might have so far. The next session, I'm going to go into some more ideas that you can use genuinely in your tutoring. So we've spoke about meaningful learning. We spoke about prior knowledge. So if you've got any questions, please do put them down. I'd love to kind of get engaged with those. Okay, so someone's just asking me to go back to this slide here, these 3 ideas here. So the one I really like here is just a question that's been asked to me directly, is getting your students to make predictions. So the question was, how do I actually do that? So what subject do you teach, if I don't mind you asking? Okay, English. So for example, if you've got a poem that you're trying to get through, just do the first stanza and try and get your students to make predictions about where they think the poem is going to go, for example. Now, this is not about me trying them to see whether they know the poem off by heart. But it's I might be trying to see if they understand the writer's style. Do they even know who the writer is? Do they even recognize the structure of the poem, for example? If we're doing a sonnet, I can ask them to make predictions about the next couple of lines. If they don't understand the rhyming structure, then that tells me something. If we've just read a chapter of a book, Animal Farm, we've read one chapter, Old Major's just sung Beasts of England to everyone, I can ask my students to make a prediction about what's going to happen next. Now, if my students make no link to Old Major, then maybe they haven't understood his importance from chapter 1 before we go into chapter 2. If they start to make a prediction that he dies in chapter 2 or he's going to die later on in the book, then that's really good. It tells me that they've actually processed what is happening in that first subject. If they are unable to make any predictions, then I need to ask myself, have they really understood what happened in chapter 1? And then I can ask myself, as the tutor, as the educator, the one with the experience, is it worth me keep going if they haven't understood the start of the book, which is quite important to the whole book of Animal Farm? So there's some ideas. So we're not asking them to make predictions in kind of random guesses. We're trying to ascertain what they know. If you're teaching somewhere like maths, I often will put up a diagram with no question and say, what might the question be about? That tells me if the student is able to recognize, are there some parallel lines in the question? If they haven't spotted those parallel lines, then we need to have a discussion about that. Maybe they're not sure what parallel lines is. I need to go back and check that. So that's just little ideas about predictions is really useful. So let's go into some more ideas for your tutoring. So some practical ideas about these ideas. Just to sum up, meaningfulness is when we take newer information and it is combined with our prior knowledge. That assimilation process makes new knowledge that is stronger and allows us to learn more, remember more, keep learning, and understand the context in which we're working in. So creating retrieval cues. Let's try and say that again. Creating retrieval cues. So we spoke about this a little bit when I was talking about number 1 and 2, student 1 and 2. If we teach something, anything, in a very specific way, what we are sometimes doing is creating very specific retrieval cues. If I was to give another maths example, if when I'm doing some trigonometry, I only ever show my students a right angle triangle like that, appreciate it's not drawn perfectly. If I only ever show them a triangle looking like that, they will only ever assume that the question has to look like that for it to be a right angle trig question. I need to make sure that they see other triangles. I need to make sure that they see triangles in different ways. So their memory is not linked to a specific cue, i.e. this one here. If I only ever show them triangles like that, they will only ever think the question is about like that. Interestingly, when they were doing some studies about this a few years ago to do with primary students, everyone recognized this as a triangle. Everyone recognized this. But many students said that this was not a triangle because it didn't look like all the triangles they'd seen. Even less when it looked like this. Even less when we had a proper scalene triangle. And that's because they had created a specific cue to do with this. Now, the way I think about this sometimes is to do with parking a car. So we want our students' memories to be non-context specific. And we want this so they can recall information without having to be reliant on the new one looking like the previous questions, like I just talked about with right angle triangles there. Now, this is not the same as only introducing information with no context cues. I'm not saying I should only ever start with some questions. It's about providing this new information in multiple contexts so our students can connect the concept to prior knowledge and not just the context in which we are looking at. If you think about this as parking a car, reverse parking a car. I'm sure many of us remember learning to drive and reverse parking a car. Now, I remember it very much the same. My driving instructor would take me to the same car park, pretty much the same space, and say, you put the car in line with that tree, You reverse until your wing mirror is in line with that car. You turn a quarter, you park the car. Very specifically, you kind of go like that. So I would only ever know that to drive the car, I had to park next to the car, turn it a quarter, reverse back, turn it a bit more, and then just hope it would park. Now, I got very good at parking in that space with that car. But when I went and got my own car, which was slightly different dimensions, I wasn't parking it perfectly. I'd passed my test, but I wasn't parking it perfectly. And when I went to spaces that were a bit more narrow, I found it really hard. Or I went to a space once and there wasn't a car either side. I'd lost my retrieval cue. I wasn't able to spot it elsewhere. So what I wanted to do is my driving instructor to show me parking different cars in different scenarios, in different places. And now I've got that. Now I've driven many cars and parked in many spaces, sometimes with a car on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes both, sometimes not at all. I've got a much better idea of how to park the car. Now, a more solid example here might be teaching your students how to annotate a piece of poetry. If you only ever show students a poem that follows a specific rhyming structure, A, B, A, B, then the student will only associate poems with things that follow A, B, A, B. I'm sure many English tutors can remember having to convince a student that a poem doesn't have to rhyme. I'm pretty sure I thought a poem could only be a poem if it was a limerick for quite a long time, because they're the only poems I'd ever seen. So we need to be conscious of when we are delivering new information to our students that we're not just giving it in the same way each time. Otherwise, our students only associate that new knowledge with that context, which is not strong and it's not flexible, as shown by with our student with 1 and 2 in the perimeter section. Has anyone got any questions specifically about that one I showed there? So how can we do that is one of the questions into. So like really, I would go into really simple mode. If I'm doing something with maths, make sure I show my shape in different rotations. If I'm doing something with shapes. If I'm measuring angles, make sure I'm not only ever doing it with horizontal line. You'll be amazed at the difference if you just go from horizontal to vertical lines. In English, make sure you see, before you say this is a poem, say these are types of poems. And then you can go into the specifics. But if you say, well, we're studying poetry, here's a poem that follows A, B, A, B, that inference might be made from a student. Whereas if you say, here are some types of poem, we are going to be focusing on this one, the student has a much better body of knowledge of what to do. Okay, let's keep going. Word diagrams. Now, I really like word diagrams. They're a really brilliant way to help your students categorize new information. And they see the ideas as objects that fit into their prior knowledge. Now, this can be linked to what we've spoken about with assimilation theory, because the bodies of knowledge are organized in a hierarchical manner. We have information under that. Now, word diagrams, which I will show in a moment, they help create organization of information rather than it just being loads and loads of random bits of data or facts. What they also do is they reduce the cognitive load on our students, which we've talked about in previous webinars, because they are externalizing and capturing information. When we've captured it and written it down in an organized fashion, we now have more working memory to go elsewhere and focus on other things. You'll see word diagrams. As soon as you see them, you'll be like, oh, I see these all the time in documentation, or in if you've ever got kind of a leaflet through the door and they're trying to explain something. So let's have a look. So here are some word diagrams. These are what we call container models. So the one on the left is what we call a chunking model, where we have our information and we've broken it down. So I've shown this via the idea if we have bodies of knowledge. Bodies of knowledge live in two different ways. They are either concepts or propositions. And concepts are individuals' ideas and propositions are whole ideas. Now, the one on the rest is a compare model. And again, I've shown it. We have prior knowledge, we have new knowledge, and when they come together, we form new meaning. Now, these just examples here of writing down information like this helps the student organize the information, and make better meaning from them because they aren't just single bits of information. So if I just teach propositions and then I get my students to see them as a word model where they are below bodies of knowledge and they are made up of whole ideas, that is much better for kind of the web of knowledge we spoke about. So they're container models. Another example would be path models. So the one on the left is a sequence. And I've given the example where a brain identifies commonalities in something. That leads to integration via something called consolidation. And then these become part of the schema. Or we have a cause and effect method when two things lead to something else. And again, what these are about are just creating organization. So here's an example I use all the time when I'm working with students, and we're doing stuff on trapeziums and parallelograms. So I've used a compare method here, where the things they share have gone in the middle, and the things they have separately on the individual sides of the Venn diagram. Now, what this helps the student do is see that trapezium and parallelograms are linked. They are both quadrilaterals, but they are different. One has one set of parallel lines, the other has two set of parallel lines. And we can go into more detail here if I wanted. But the whole point is here, this visualization here helps the student process the information rather than me just teaching these individual bits of information that just sit by themselves. Any question on word models? Someone's just asked me to go back to go through these. So I'll just put these up briefly. So we've got container models here. We've got a chunking method and a compare method. Chunking is about breaking down ideas. Comparing is literally, we can see the similarities and differences. Venn diagrams are absolutely brilliant for this. They're really intuitive. Your students will be really good at creating them. And they are very good at showing if we want to highlight differences and similarities between two things. So you could do, we go back to our example. Types of poem, we could have two types of poem, their links and their differences. If we were talking about different artists, we could link when they worked or when they didn't work. If we wanted to work with history, we could talk about two battles and links that they had and separations, or two characters in history, characters, two people in history, and talk about those. They're really great activities. They're brilliant starter activities as well for ascertaining my students' prior knowledge. And then the other ones were path models, which are much better if we want to show the link and development of an idea. So the one on the left, sequences, is brilliant, obviously, for something like history or anything to kind of do with geography, where we're doing a cause and effect idea. And then the one on the right, which actually cause and effect, when we've got multiple things coming together to cause something else. So they're really good starter activities. So someone asking, when can I use these? Literally any time in your session. I use these as starters. I use them at the end to kind of ascertain how my students are doing. I do them within a session to see if we can work together to create one. I use these all the time. They're really effective, really effective. Okay, this is one of my favorite understandings of making meaning when meaning is hard to find. Now, what I mean by this is we've talked about how to make information meaningful to our students. But sometimes that can be really difficult if we are doing something that's quite hard. So I'll use the examples of surds in maths. Now, surds are quite a difficult idea to just teach completely individually because they feel like they don't really link to anything else. So here's how I would explain surds to a student. I would say surds comes from the Latin word surdus, which meant deaf or mute. So I've linked it to what my student knows about the word deaf. I've made a link between surds and deaf. Now, this relation to deaf hopefully gives some meaning. It's connected this new word that meant nothing to their current vocabulary. So there's a link there. But it does not explain the significance of this term. So I've just made a link, but I haven't explained the significance of this term. I now say the concept of surds dates to ancient Greece, where Pythagoras discovered irrational numbers. Now, at this stage, I'm hoping my students have already done Pythagoras, which they will have done if I'm doing surds for them. So I've now got a link between surds and a previously learnt concept. So they can see this doesn't just randomly live in their understanding of maths, it lives somewhere. I've also introduced the concept of irrational numbers. I would then say by irrational, I mean a number that can't be written as a fraction. So, for example, root 2 or pi. Now, the student knows pi and they recognize root 2, and they can connect the idea of this unfamiliar word of irrational to those ideas. And I've done that by demonstration. And I would probably ask some questions at this point to ensure the idea is taken. So we've gone from this random word surge on the screen to a link to the word deaf, which will become more apparent. They've heard the link to Pythagoras, so they know it's just not randomly linked. Irrational numbers, which I've now explained. I'm going to go deeper now. I say in the Middle Ages, Islamic mathematicians called these irrational numbers inaudible. They called them inaudible, which was later translated to the Latin word of surdus, which we said earlier meant deaf. So the Middle Age Islamic mathematicians called these irrational numbers inaudible. That was translated to surdus, which we know is Latin for deaf. Now here we've made a link between irrational numbers that cannot be said as a fraction, which I would have explained when I'm talking about pi. And this is where surdus come from. So the student has now made the link between surds, the term irrational, and this has given them meaning to the word surd because it's linked to previously known language and mathematical notation. I haven't just put surds on the board. Now, surds is quite a difficult concept to explain, so I've had to think about how I'm going to make it meaningful to my student. It's not an easy thing to do. I've deliberately chosen quite a complicated idea. Now, when we do work on surds, that's going to keep linking to this idea that I've already brought in. So I'm not just saying, here's a surd, learn it. I'm saying, here's the word surd. Here's how it's linked to some of your previous language. Here's how it's linked to some areas of maths that you recognize. So we can now bring it into your web of knowledge. I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples in your subject area where you bring in new vocab that is difficult. Just going to give you a moment to just kind of have a moment to think and reflect upon a difficult word that you bring to your subject and how you might explain that to a subject, to your student. So one that quite comes up often in English is synodich, which comes from the Greek of syn, which means together, and interpretation of igdich. So if you think of an object that's been reduced to a part, for example, if we said a car has new wheels, this would be an interpretation of the thing because we're talking about what it goes together to make. And that comes from the Greek for together and interpretation. So interpretation of something being together. When my students move on to more complicated examples, such as Browning's Prometheus Lovin's poem, when the male constantly is referring to Prometheus as yellow hair and reducing her to a single physical trait. So I haven't just said the word, I've tried to link it to some other knowledge my students might have. And I can do that in different ways in different subject areas. Another idea would be summarizing. Summarizing is a brilliant way to understand what new meaning your student has made. So I've just delivered my content on surds. I'm very proud of myself. I've delivered surds. And I asked the student to summarize that information back to me. Now, summarizing is an incredibly complicated skill. Not only do you have to reduce the amount of words, but you really have to understand what has been said to you in order to say it back more concisely. This is a brilliant way of trying to see how your students are doing. If you try and get them to summarize and say it back to you, you will pick out loads of gaps in their knowledge or things they've done really well. And that ascertains whether you can move on or off. So if we were doing a lesson here, I might ask someone to summarize what we mean by surds. And I would understand a lot from their answer. Doesn't matter whether it's the perfect answer, a middle answer, or no answer at all. I can learn something from that. So ask your students to summarize what you've just taught them and come back. So we've just talked about the idea of what a sonnet is. Can you just explain that to me? Nice and just summarize it to me. How would you summarize this idea? How would you summarize the Battle of Hastings to someone who didn't know about it? You'll learn a lot about your students' understanding from getting them to summarize. Rehearsal is a really good idea here to help make meaning. So the role of linguistic structures, how we talk, is a really well-known understanding of how well events are known. We can't expect students to remember phrases unless we have been able to get them to say them successfully. And this idea, what Tom Sherrington would call deliberate rehearsal. So we are doing this very deliberately. The problem with retrieval, as we've spoke about, is it assumes that we have some knowledge to be recalled. Now, this can be really difficult if the student hasn't actually practiced saying a word or a phrase that they're unfamiliar with. Now, rehearsal is not just getting your students to say things verbatim. I say, you say, I say, we say. Because that's just a sign that they're not actually learning. We're just getting them to repeat stuff back to it. Rehearsal can look like different things. It can be asking multiple choice questions. Can they pick out the correct definition? It can be a really careful discussion about something. It can get them to annotate a diagram with some missing words. We're rehearsing the process. The important bit is the material is being accessed. We spoke about this in previous webinars. So if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about to do with retrieval, you can go and look at some of the other webinars. The thing is, everyone forgets. So we want our students rehearsing things. Now, I think a really nice example of this is MFL tutoring. If anyone here is tutoring modern foreign languages, kudos. Some of the best techniques are used in MFL lessons. Rehearsal is a really key part of the learning process. We can't get our students to understand a new word if we don't get them to say it. And by getting the student to rehearse the saying of it, we are helping them access that information more flexibly, and especially under pressure. So here's an example. If I'm introducing fractions to a primary school student, and I give them an example and I'm explaining the importance of language when we're working with fractions. The numerator is the number on the top, the denominator is the number on the bottom of a fraction. I don't just move on here. I will ask my students to repeat that line. That means the terminology has been used. It becomes part of their lexicon. It's not just a word on the board or my whiteboard or word I'm saying to them. It actually becomes something they have heard themselves say. And that means they're going to be more confident to use it next time. It also means if I'm using complicated words, I can check very early on that they're not misunderstanding how the word is said, which is a really easy thing to do. Another example would be if I'm introducing students to the water cycle in science. After introducing this new knowledge, I would give students a diagram and say, can you put the missing words in? I could even give them the key words to put in those missing words in. I'm getting to rehearse not just the word, but where it fits in the water cycle. And that is helping make meaning to them. And it also helps me assess the meaning they have found. So they might know all these words, they might know all the definitions, but if they're not able to connect them correctly to the diagram, then that tells me as the educator that there's something missing there and we need to go back and look at something. So 2 little ideas there. Get your students to summarize information you've been given and get your students to rehearse what they've been saying. And that combines with the idea of we spoke about making meaning when meaning is hard to find. We spoke about word diagrams and we spoke about retrieval cues, the importance of those. There's kind of just some ideas we can bring into our tutoring. So has anyone got any questions at that time? I'll just give you a moment to reflect upon some of the stuff we discussed there. Okay, so someone was just sent me a question about summarizing. I wouldn't overcomplicate summarizing. I would literally just be asking my students, can you just explain what I've said to you? Something really simple as that. It's a really useful way for me to ascertain what I'm doing. It also helps the students get confident verbalizing stuff using new language. It also means if they're not using the right language, so if they're saying the number on top of the fraction, I can say, oh, we're going to call it the numerator. I can pick that up very early on. and not wait for it to be a mistake that maybe an hour later or in a week's time is still there. So it's just a little thing you can do. Whereas rehearsing is a lot more of getting my students confident using the words straight away. So we say it together, we say it in context, but also I get them to rehearse. Classic is like parts of a circle. Person's asked this saying, a maths teacher, part of the circles. I get my students to rehearse that labeling a lot because it gets them really confident using that knowledge. And then that knowledge becomes a lot more flexible because it's formed a strong body of knowledge. So my key takeaways that we've considered here to do with meaningful learning is it's always important to consider and check what your student knows. That is incredibly important in this process. And we can't assume that our students have the same prior knowledge. So I'm sure you've got some of your sessions ready to go for your tutors. That's fantastic. But remember, each of your students is different and they are coming to you with different prior knowledge. We have to find a way to ascertain that knowledge. And because of this, we need to make sure our learning is meaningful to the student, not just to us as the tutor. It's really easy for us to make references to stuff that we assume the student knows. Oh, so it's kind of like this. Oh, it's kind of like this book. It's kind of like this author. Well, me saying it's kind of like this author to a student who does not know that author is absolutely no help. It may even have a negative effect of showing them all the stuff they don't know, and it becomes even more isolated. Now, that may mean a lot to me. I might make a reference about dial-up internet, showing my age there, dial-up internet. If I make a reference to that at any point in any work that I've done, well, that may mean absolutely nothing to my student. I had an example of this when I was chatting with my son the other day. We were watching something on TV, and he was, did you watch this show every week? We were talking about a show I used to watch as a kid, Robot Wars. And I was saying, it was only on once a week. And my son had absolutely no idea. He could not understand what I was talking about. What do you mean? I don't go into what you mean, Daddy. Like, what do you mean only once a week? Because it was not mean. What I'd said had no meaning to him. So remember, your students are individual and you need to make it meaningful to them. And my top tip for using meaningful learning is just to ask yourself, look at the first resource for your next tutoring session, or before your next tutoring session, open that first resource and just look at it and just ask yourself, am I making any assumptions about what my student already know? Is there anything I'm assuming they know? Because if I've made any assumptions that is not true, it's very easy for me to go down the wrong road of my lesson. So if I've made any assumptions, I may just ask myself, how do I know the student knows this? Could I do a quick yes or no activity at the start? Could I get them to explain something to me? Am I going to do summarizing throughout the session? What am I assuming my student knows? Is a really powerful question to ask yourself as a student. If you want to know more about this, there's an absolutely brilliant book by Sarah Cottingham, or Sarah Cottingham, as she was previously known. It's called Altenberg's Meaningful Learning Action. I've referenced this, some of the stuff from this book quite a lot. I'm actually reading this for the third time currently with a educational book group that I run. It's an absolutely brilliant book about this idea. And what we've been talking about here are some quite difficult high-level concepts in education. But I think meaningfulness, the reason I've made this webinar is it is so important to make what we are saying meaningful to our students, not just meaningful to us. Otherwise, we're teaching for ourselves, not for our student. And I think that's a really powerful idea, especially for us as tutors in the context in which we work in. We are so well placed to help make meaning for our students. If you want to find out more about me, the best place to go is on LinkedIn, which is a QR code at the top. Go and ask me questions on there, or just follow me or read my newsletters. If you want a podcast, there's something called Tutoring Tips, which is where 50 tutors have shared their top tip about tutoring. You can go and listen to that. I run a WhatsApp group to do with pedagogy, where once a week you get a little tip from me or another tutor about pedagogy. That's utterly free to join. Or if you want to learn more about Navigator Tutor, there's a QR code on the bottom right where you can find out more about my CPD platform. But the one I'd really like to point you to there is LinkedIn. That's the best place to come and find me and ask me questions. It's been absolutely brilliant working with you all this evening. Thank you for everyone joined live. Thank you for everyone joined as a recording. And the final thing I'll leave you with is this idea of think about what are you assuming your students to know, because we need to make the learning meaningful to them, not to us. Thank you for everyone who has joined this evening. Take care, and thank you so much for everyone for joining us.